are going to speak what migrant domestic workers want the governments to do. Governments are now at the UN headquarters in New York, starting to review what they have done in the past 4 years to implement the Global Compact on Migration. This Global Compact of Migration was adopted almost 4 years ago. And that gave us hope and a lot of excitement that governments have pledged their commitments to improve the rights of migrant workers and to protect the welfare of the migrant workers, including migrant domestic workers. The objective 16 of the compact speaks about empowerment of migrant workers so that they can enjoy their rights. So almost 4 years have passed, and we welcome this International Migration Review Forum that gives us an opportunity to look back and to plan for the future, to see how we can do better, to fix the gaps so that migrant workers, migrant domestic workers will be protected, will have decent work. So today, I'm very excited to have this side event so that we will be able to talk about the key priority of the IDWF. That is on freedom of association, the right for migrant domestic workers to come together, to organize, to have a collective voice so that they can have a seat at the table on decision makings. And that is the basic step that they can start improving their rights. And I'm very, very excited to introduce our panelists for this side event, which is only 1 hour. So first, we will start by having the ILO specialist on migration, Rizzo Chalewinski, who will guide us on the ILO instrument that we can use or migrant domestic workers can use to protect their right on freedom of association and why it is so important for achievement of their rights and welfare. And then we will listen to our Vice President, Carmen British. She's also the General Secretary of the UPAC, a large domestic workers union in Argentina. And she will tell us how her union has been able to use the right, the collective bargaining, freedom of association to extend social protections to migrant domestic workers working in Argentina in a country. So from her, we know this is possible, that can be done. But then even without these rights, these legal rights, migrant domestic workers have been very courageous and have been very creative to find different ways and means so that their voice can be heard. So we will hear Nasrika, the field organizer of Indonesian migrant domestic workers in Malaysia, on what she has been doing and what has been achieved in Malaysia. And also Marianne Abuda, the founding president of the Sandigan Domestic Workers Association in Kuwait. And finally, Albert Nehru, the General Secretary of KUDEA in Kenya, on how her union, as in the country of origin, to support these initiatives, which are small but very, very important if we want to see how migrant domestic workers' rights will be achieved. So let us start. We don't have much time, and I would want the panelists to keep to the time, 8 to 10 minutes maximum, and so that we will have some time to hear the feedbacks and comments from the floor. So welcome, Lisa Chalewinski, please.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and a warm welcome to all the participants in this really important, I think, IMRF side event, focusing very much on domestic workers and their fundamental rights, and in particular, the right to freedom of association. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm representing ILO. I'm actually based in the ILO regional office for the Arab states in Beirut. And so I will also give some perspectives from this region. First of all, I'd just like to welcome the express reference to women migrant domestic workers in the latest and hopefully last version of the IMRF Progress Declaration. And this is an important reference because it highlights, this is paragraph 10 of the declaration, it highlights their key role in the care economy. It notes that migrant domestic workers are often working in the informal economy, and also underscores the need to protect them from violence and harassment at work. So this reference is important, but while it is important, we should not forget, of course, that the principal international instruments which govern domestic work are those found in the ILO, and particularly the Domestic Workers Convention of 2011, Convention 189, as well as its accompanying recommendation of 203, and more recently, the Violence and Harassment Convention, dealing with violence and harassment at work, which is obviously very relevant to the situation of domestic workers. Now, why is this issue, why is the question of domestic work continuing to be an important one? And one, I think that the international community, including in the discussions on the Global Compact, should draw more attention to. I think in June of last year, the ILO released a global report called Making Decent Work a Reality for Domestic Workers. And the report examined progress on delivering the decent work for domestic workers in the 10 years since the adoption of Convention 189. So it was adopted on the 10th anniversary of the convention. Now, C189 is a landmark ILO instrument. First of all, it recognizes that domestic work is real work and plays an essential role in meeting care and domestic needs of millions of households. And I think this state of affairs was unequivocally confirmed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, it underscores that domestic workers are entitled to fundamental principles and rights at work. And we know these are important enabling rights, including the right, of course, to freedom of association, which is very much the focus of this side event, as well as to decent working conditions on a basis of equality with other workers. Now, the convention, after 10 years, has only been ratified by 35 countries. So this may not seem a lot, but I think its impact has been nonetheless significant. It has elevated the dignity of women and men, domestic workers. It has changed mindsets and perceptions about domestic work. And it has also led to the adoption of numerous national laws and regulations on domestic work, many of which are indeed based on the C189 provisions. So I just want to give, I've been asked to look at some of the emerging trends and also to focus a little bit on the region. And I just want to draw on this report and also an accompanying regional brief, which was prepared towards the end of last year, and which I've asked the organizers to circulate to participants. So let's just give you a snapshot of some of the key global data based on pre-pandemic figures. So the reference year is 2019. So in the world, we had over 75 million domestic workers. So these are workers 15 years or older. the majority of them women, 58%, 58 million women and 17, almost 18 million men. So women comprise over 76% of all domestic workers, with the highest proportion being in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Europe. Whereas in the Arab states, interestingly, men domestic workers actually outnumber women. Men tend to work as drivers, cooks, and gardeners, whereas women tend to work as cleaners and caregivers. Importantly, 8 out of 10 domestic workers are informally employed, according to the report. And this is significant, of course, because it means that such workers have no or little effective access to labor and social protections. And workers who work behind closed doors, so your live-in domestic workers, are particularly vulnerable in this regard. Now, when we look at the Arab states in particular, we see almost 6.6 million domestic workers. Again, as I said, 4.2 million are men and 2.4 million are women. What is interesting with regard to the Arab states is that they have the highest proportion of domestic workers in total employment at 12, just over 12%, which is considerably higher in some countries like Saudi Arabia, where domestic workers make up almost 28% of the labor market, which is the highest share of domestic workers in the labor market in the world. What we've seen also in the region is an annual growth rate in the number of domestic workers at around just under 9%. It's a growing demand, which is attributed to the higher labor force participation rates among women, growing dependency ratios, as well as large households in the region that traditionally rely on home-based care. During 2020, we did see a bit of a reduction in the Gulf and quite a severe reduction in Jordan and Lebanon. And Lebanon, of course, that was largely to do with the multiple crises that are currently affecting the country. And of course, the vast majority of domestic workers in the region are migrants. We don't have any actually updated global or regional estimates. In 2013, our global and regional estimates did focus on migrant workers, and we found that over 80% of domestic workers in the Arab states were indeed migrants. And of course, they're almost exclusively migrants in the Gulf. And we're also seeing a growing number of workers coming from various parts of Africa, for example, Ethiopia and Uganda. So what are some of the key policy trends? And the picture is actually not very, on the whole, encouraging, because we see that in the Arab states, over 90%, and this is also the case for the Asia region, 90% of domestic workers remain excluded from the protection of labor and social security laws. And this has a direct impact on ability to exercise fundamental rights like freedom of association and collective bargaining. We've seen a lot of laws since the adoption of 189, separate laws focusing on regulating the domestic work sector, but often the protections are lower than for other workers under the labor law. And, you know, where there are protections, they're under less favorable conditions compared with workers generally. And this is particularly the case when we look at working time, wages, and maternity protection. So starting with working time, there's been progress in the region when it comes to providing weekly rest and annual paid leave, albeit that leave is still shorter for domestic workers than other workers. However, we see that over 75% of domestic workers work for more than 30 hours, for more than 48 hours per week, and the majority, in fact, work much, much longer hours. Because when you look at the legal limits in some countries, they can range from 8 hours a day, which is the lowest, and that's the case for Jordan, to up to 10, 12, 15 hours a day. So they work far longer than 48 hours a week. They over 80% remain outside of minimum wage coverage. Another finding is that full-time or live-in domestic workers tend to earn the lowest wages, certainly the case when it comes to the Arab states. There are also gaps in social protection. Only just under 4% of domestic workers in the Arab states are covered by at least one branch of Social Security. So only in 2 countries. And that compares very unfavorably to the next lowest, which is in the Asia Pacific region at almost 28%. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on domestic workers. The reports that I've mentioned highlight some of those impacts. Yes, domestic workers provided essential services to households, but they're also at greatest risks of the virus. And particularly freelance and live-out domestic workers were most affected. At the height of the pandemic, the report notes that job losses among domestic workers range from 5 to 50%, depending on countries in question, whereas the average was 15% of job losses among other workers. And also there are other impacts, lack of access to personal protection equipment, shortcomings in healthcare provision, increased working time, which I've already mentioned, which increased even more during lockdowns, as well as non-payment or delayed payment of wages, as well as further restrictions on free movement. So with regard to some recommendations, and I'll end here, Elizabeth, just a few recommendations that are important, I think, to consider. The need to reduce working hours and ensure wages of domestic workers are on par with the wages of other workers. So here, of course, social dialogue plays or should play an important role in fixing minimum wage levels, ensuring also that domestic workers are protected under minimum wage systems. The need for innovative solutions regarding labor inspection in private households. So there are good practices across the world in this regard. Promoting access to justice for domestic workers, strengthening dispute resolution mechanisms, enabling domestic worker representatives to bring complaints, and ensuring protections from reprisals. Particularly relevant to this region is the need to ensure that domestic workers are free to change their employers without the permission of previous employers. This should include a unilateral right of domestic workers to terminate their contracts subject to any contractual notice periods. And of course, in the Arab states, this really is all about dismantling the kafala sponsorship system, as well as the need to dispense with the absconding framework, when retaliation for leaving their jobs, employers can file absconding charges against domestic workers. And this is something that the ILO, along with a number of other agencies, IOM, UN Women, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights are working on. And finally, and this is very much the focus of the side event, the need to fully implement the right to freedom of association and collective barriers by addressing some of the barriers. Collective bargaining, by addressing some of the barriers to freedom of association. And this includes, of course, exclusions from the labor law. And this is not just about domestic workers, it's also about the employers, because of course, if you're going to have collective bargaining, you need employer organizations. And again, there are some good practices across the world in this regard. And of course, this is an important role that the IDWF plays. And I'm sure our next speakers will be able to give us some insights and, give their experiences of how some of these barriers can be overcome. So thank you. I hope that suffices in terms of introductory remarks. And I look forward really to hearing the voices of the workers themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Rizal. Very good. Yeah, now let us hear Carmen Blites from UPAC, Argentina. Carmen, please.
Hola, buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, dear colleagues. Your wise words reflect, and this is our colleague from the ILO, they reflect the fight, the struggles that we have as domestic workers at the world level, not only regionally. And I have to talk about Argentina's experience. This is something that we have been discussing for many years now. I remember that we discussed this with many of the colleagues who are present here today. We talked about this topic. For example, in Chile, we had a migration meeting, and that was, we discussed the migration corridors at the time, how domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, would suffer from different unsatisfied needs and the violence and not having the right to social security and every other kind of violence just because they were migrants, internal and external migrants. I remember that at the time an agreement was signed with ILO about the Paraguay-Argentina migration corridor, where it established that other corridors were going to be set up around the world. And for us, it was a great experience to be able to work on that agreement. And from there, we developed an application for migrants about Argentina's law at the time and the protection that was afforded to migrants at the time. In Argentina, migrants have or are on an equal footing compared to our national or our citizens. So Argentine provisions, Argentine law protect both domestic workers from Argentina and domestic workers who are migrants and who arrive at our country. So the important thing was the process that our organization pursued. In 1956, there was an agreement that afforded no protection to domestic workers, and then Convention 189. In Argentina, we used that convention as a tool to develop a national law and to protect workers, but not only domestic workers, but also to provide examples to the rest of the world, because we can include in our national laws, we can include migrant domestic workers so that they afforded the same level of protection as that afforded to nationals or national workers. And so based on the ratification of Convention 189, which took place in 2014, as a result of this, we had a national law that afforded total protection and social security to all domestic workers. But still, in Argentina, despite the fact that we've had a law for 9 years, and this law provides social security, vacation leave, but despite this, we have 1.3 million of unregistered domestic workers. We should have no domestic workers that is unregistered, because there is a protection law that establishes that the employer must meet these standards, because it's a right of the worker and an obligation of the employer to register the worker. There's a single social security system that is only applicable to domestic workers, but unfortunately, there's still a long way to go. And we need to make employers understand that domestic workers, not only in Argentina, but actually around the world, are workers. It's not just a person who helps us out. It's not a person in our family, right? They have to respect our cultures, because we have domestic workers who are of African descent, indigenous descent, and they need to maintain their culture because those are their roots. And colleagues who come from other countries to fight, because nobody wants to leave their country just because they leave their country. domestic workers leave their countries to improve their livelihoods and the lives of their families first, and then their lives. Because to get to that situation of having to leave a country, that is only because of their desire to improve. But for that, they need to undergo several situations. They have to and even if this is not visible, sometimes we need to think that these migrant domestic workers go to a country they don't know the laws, they don't know where they have to go, and they suffer, they can be subject to trafficking. And then child labor. There's internal migration. People come from rural areas to the cities. Small children migrate as domestic workers internally. And there's a prohibition. Convention 189 establishes this. There's a child labor prohibition, of course, but we need to supervise this. We need to control that there is no child labor. Argentina has had many achievements. They put the salary discussion at the national level. This is not a collective bargaining agreement, but we do have a tripartite commission, and we discuss with employers the salary increases, and not only salaries, but also all the other rights, bonuses, for example, the fact that employers have to register their domestic worker. The state provides a subsidy, as our colleague from the ILO said. The big problem we had arising from COVID-19 was unemployment and many difficult situations because employers could not sustain the employment relationship with their workers. And so we have a program in Argentina where the employer that registers the employer receives a subsidy of 30 to 50% of the salary of the worker. And this is directly deposited in a bank account. This is important because the requirement is that the employee is registered. But then once the employee comes in the banking system, the economic system, she will be able to have a credit card, she will be able to have a salary account. There is a recognition of her work. In addition to this, we are working on an application that has to do with an employment service, which is going to be done through an application that works on iPhone and on Samsung, where employers and workers are brought together to foster employment. We need to also foster the registration of employees with Social Security. So this application has been developed by UPAC, our organization. Therefore, workers' data belong to our organization. And we can oversee then that the employer that hired a worker, and whether this is a migrant worker or a national worker, the employer can be supervised, and we can check that the worker is registered, that is being given the rights, and that also that worker is not subject to violence, harassment at the workplace, or even trafficking. And so we're trying to make Convention 190 more visible because Argentina ratified it. But now we need to keep working on national laws that promote these rights. It's important to reflect the voices of the workers. And it's also important to participate in every single ILO conference because all the topics always end up comprising domestic work in a cooperative, or for example, when we talk about social economy or decent work. So there are many countries that don't have domestic or national laws that we have to accompany so that those countries can have those laws. And also we need to keep fighting to make domestic work more visible and to give them rights, the rights that other workers have. Panama, for example, doesn't recognize the work of migrant domestic workers as workers, and therefore they have no kind of protection. Other countries have only a few articles that are devoted to domestic workers' rights. And so we need to fight for bills in places where there are migration laws. We need to amend them and have them favor domestic workers as well. Countries that have ratified Convention 189 have to continue fighting so that this convention is enforced, because it's very easy to ratify a convention, but it's very difficult to implement it. So these would be sort of dead provisions that are not useful for us. So let's continue having the experiences of oversight. In Argentina, for example, we signed an agreement with the Ministry of Labor to go in gated communities with the Ministry of the Interior through a request for information to request the employers that they provide the books where workers sign when they go in and then go out. And in that way, we can identify which domestic worker works with which employer. And in those gated communities that did not submit the documentation that the Ministry of Labor requested, received a 2 million peso fine. And they will do this time after time until the gated communities comply with what the Ministry of Labor states. We need to also oversee agencies, because unfortunately, that's where migrant workers resort to. And migrant domestic workers are jeopardized sometimes because of the work of these agencies. We have to provide information to our fellow domestic workers so that they don't fall prey of these organizations, these agencies. And so with these exchanges of experiences that we have in each one of our countries, we continue making this visible. The most important thing is unity. We have to join hands and to be able to help each other from one country to another, so that all domestic workers believe in the IDWF, because IDWF makes things visible, and the IDWF continues working hand in hand. This executive committee, these regions, where our colleagues from every single country in Latin America and Europe and all around the world continue implementing actions to make domestic work more visible and for them to have access to social security and decent work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now let us move to Malaysia. Let us listen to Nasrika. In the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a robust organizing of migrant domestic workers in the country, and we are very, very proud to have 2 affiliates, 2 migrant domestic workers organization joining the IDWF. And now let us hear the organizer on the ground, what she has been doing and why, and you know, what lessons are there for us all. Nasrika, please.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Nasrika. I'm Indonesian domestic workers in Malaysia, and currently I'm contribute to IDWF as a field facilitator. Yeah, I have been in Malaysia since 1997. My situation at that time is still remain the same until now, because we also receiving a lot of complaint and report from the migrant domestic workers that they still have no freedom of associations, that they're working without contract, and also passport still held by the employer and agencies. And also we are isolated in the employer house, no day off, and no access to communications. And also the system of recruitment from our country, it create the debt bondage for most of the migrant domestic workers. Since in the year of 2021, we are receiving 65 cases, and most of them is unpaid wages. The amount is around 500,000 ringgit Malaysia to 600 ringgit Malaysia. It's quite a lot. We also to identify here have the policy gaps. Yeah, the first is because of a lack of protection, lack of social protection. Even Malaysia since last year already include the domestic workers in their social security, but they are still have discrimination between local workers and also the migrant workers. The secondly, because of the situation of domestic workers who live in the employer, they are still vulnerable to the violence and also harassment. And also because of the discrimination by the Employment Act, that they still exclude domestic workers' right as another workers. They are also have a restriction for the migrant domestic workers to register their own union. We also highlight that last March 2022 that Malaysia just amend the Employment Act 1955. In that amendment, they are acknowledged domestic workers as a domestic employee. Previously, they call it servant, but they are still exclude us from the right as workers, such as they exclude from day off, working hours arrangement, maternity leave, layoff in their first schedule. So they only change the name, not the right. And also that Employment Act reform is not really compliant with the international standard on decent work of domestic workers. Why still have a lot of abuse, exploitation toward migrant domestic workers? Because in their Trade Union Act, this not allowed us to form our own union. They said only we can join the union, but here we don't have the such union that cover for domestic workers. The migrant workers, they only can join the union as a members, not for the officer. So here they have like, they have no place for the workers to voice out themselves. And they cannot bargain with the government, even though with employer. Because of the situation that still happen, so organizing migrant domestic workers is really important. In Malaysia, AMPO is lead to organize themselves since 2016, and by the support from the Philippine Embassy also, they conduct post-arrival orientation seminar in 2017, 2019. It is really best practice for the newcomers, domestic workers. They have to know about their rights, about how about Malaysian laws, and also if they have any issues, we have to complain. Actually, it must be applied to all countries about this post-arrival orientations. And about pandemic, it is established 2019. Currently, we have 130 Indonesian domestic workers. Because of the needs to strengthen the organization of migrant domestic workers, we conduct capacity building to increase their skill so that they can speak out about their issues, and also they can run their own organizations. We have a lot of training like leadership, speaking, public speaking, and also because we want our issues is come up to the media, we conduct some press statement writing, and also we keep engaged with the media. Because we also keep receiving the complaint and report from the migrant workers, so we also conduct the case management, how we assist our friend of migrant domestic workers when they have a complaint. Yeah, during the pandemic, because we have organization, so we can support each other during that pandemic. It's really a difficult time, I think, for us. So during that pandemic, we also give contribution to support our member and also another migrant workers, such as we give food support, and also we strengthen our organizing, because that time is a lockdown, so we are doing touring online. We do some online meeting and also call by phone. We also keep on handling the case of migrant domestic workers, because that time it's a lot of dispute. Yeah, report that migrant domestic were just left on the roadside and without any documents, and also they just throw the domestic workers in the road. Even there is a lot of restriction toward migrant domestic workers, because during the pandemic, the xenophobia in Malaysia is very high toward us. We try our best to build the dialogue with the government, with another stakeholder, so that they will include us in any discussion on the policy changes. We conduct it, we conduct through online, and we also directly meet the Minister of Home Affairs. We pass the memorandum to Prime Minister. Of course, we supported by local NGOs and also trade union in Malaysia. We are joined in Labor Law Reform Coalition and also Ke Arah 189 Coalition, that the one they always support us. We also lobbying a member of parliament, and also we always took place of media coverage on migrant domestic workers. Yeah, through this forum, International Migrant Forum Review 2022, we call the government to acknowledge us as a workers, and to get right as another workers, and also to allow our organization to register as a union, so that we can express ourselves and we can involve in any policy changes in future, and also to call government to abolish the discrimination to migrant domestic workers from any policies, and to make sure that Domestic Workers Act is cover and protect to all migrant domestic workers' right, and also to the most of the country to ratify the C89 and also to ratify C189 and also C190. If any follow-up question of any, I open if anyone want to contact us. This is our contact number. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasrika. We have heard you the importance of having local support from the trade unions, from other NGOs, the importance of social dialogue. I also want to add that the ILO in Bangkok through its spotlight initiatives, we also have a lot of support to do the work. Okay, now let us move to Kuwait, where a lot of organizing and capacity building is ongoing. And Abuda, the founding president of the Sandigan Kuwait Domestic Workers Association, will tell us more on how they are doing all this work. Anne, please, you have 8 minutes.
Good day, everyone. I am Anna Bunda, founder of Sandigan Kuwait and Sandigan Kuwait Domestic Workers Association. Sandigan Kuwait was founded in 2010. For you to have an idea about us, I will share to you what we are doing on the ground. What we do, we distributed 25,000 food packs in support of migrant workers affected by lockdown. We also provide medicines in support of migrant workers who got infected with coronavirus. We provide legal and paralegal assistance to migrant workers who are in need, especially domestic workers. Counseling program as part of the standard operating procedure in case handling. Support system before, during, and up to this date to the migrant domestic workers in Kuwait, be it online or offline. Create programs that will increase the impact, visibility, and value of the domestic workers in the community, like the International Domestic Workers Day celebration, which we celebrate every year. Skills enhancement and retooling, organize domestic workers from different communities, conduct activities that will uplift their morale and extend assistance to them. Recently, we have a free medical checkup for women, documented or undocumented. We have bloodletting programs and other activities. Conduct capacity building, leadership and organizing trainings, negotiation and asserting rights through the help of IDWF, ILO, Centro, and Learn. Attended forums, consultations, and create recommendations. Mostly, we submit our recommendations to our government. We also link different communities to stakeholders since we are working closely with almost all NGOs and CSOs in Kuwait, as well as embassies of labor-sending countries. We also participated in many forums representing the domestic worker sector. We also conducted researches, studies, survey to check on the situation of the domestic workers in Kuwait. So situation overview of migrant domestic workers. The current population of domestic workers in Kuwait is more or less 608,000. Majority are women. Majority are living with the employer's home, which makes them more vulnerable. Domestic workers law was enacted in 2015. The implementation of the law is quite challenging since we have only one office that caters the complaints of all domestic workers. With 11 labor inspectors assigned. Not all domestic workers are aware of the procedure in filing complaint. There is no SOP. Not all are aware of the location of the office since most of the domestic workers doesn't have day off. Plus, they added additional bureaucratic procedure in filing complaints. Of course, the pandemic affects the slow implementation of the domestic workers law. Sandigan Kuwait and Sandigan Kuwait domestic workers case officers handled cases such as no day off, no break time, overwork, lack of sleep, unpaid salary, and some encountered salary deduction, end of service benefits or indemnity for domestic workers, physical abuse, verbal, sexual, psychological abuse, selling and buying of domestic workers online and offline. Domestic workers are not allowed to form union here in Kuwait. Of course, the root of all problem, which is the kafala system. No freedom of association for migrant domestic workers. According to the law of Kuwait, in Kuwait and other GCC countries, the law of association prohibits migrant workers or migrant domestic workers to form a union or participate in their establishment. This right is limited to Kuwaiti nationals. Non-Kuwaiti workers are permitted only to join the union, mostly in the oil sector, on two conditions. They should have work permit and have been in the country for 5 years prior to the issuance of the labor law, but do not have the right to elect on one of them to represent their views and opinion in the union's board. Although we are not permitted to form a union, we are able to find ways to create an association for domestic workers in Kuwait, starting with organizing the Sandigan Kuwait Domestic Workers Association in 2018. And in 2021, we have the Ethiopian Domestic Workers Association. So freedom of association as path towards labor rights of migrant domestic workers. I put it already in the, I will just freedom of association leads to improvement in all other labor rights. When these rights are in place, you are likely to see higher compliance on all other issues, including health and safety, wages, and overtime. It will eliminate discrimination among migrant domestic workers. Example, the benefits that the Filipino workers enjoyed will be enjoyed by other nationalities as well because we are in one sector. Joining with other others to bargain, negotiate, and match the strength of more powerful groups of people. This particularly applies to associations of vulnerable people, such as domestic workers. Freedom of associations protects their rights and to collectively bargain with their employers. Freedom of association is different from other fundamental rights because it does not merely protect an individual's activities. Rather, it protects group activities that an individual cannot perform by themselves. This recognizes that when people from a group, that group can take on a life of its own and develop needs that are bigger than those of its individual members. Freedom of association, therefore, is both collective right and individual right. Freedom of association is one of the fundamental freedoms. Organizing, so we have the Sandigan Kuwait and Sandigan Kuwait Domestic Workers Association and the Ethiopian Domestic Workers Association, which goal is it is 100% domestic workers association that aims to empower, provide assistance and protection for domestic workers, and to upgrade and transform their lives from lower income bracket to sustainable income through livelihood development programs that we do. Collaboration, so I put there the activities that we are doing, the skills development, negotiation, case handling, and I put it already in the PowerPoint. So collaboration with stakeholders, work with almost all labor sending embassies. Last June 2021, we have a stakeholder forum together with ambassador and labor attaches of labor sending countries. We tackled current issues and status of domestic workers and their community. This June, we are going to have another stakeholders forum wherein we are going to tackle more on country of origin, recruitment process and protection mechanism, country of destination, services available, common cases handled, challenges and recommendations, and reintegration program. What are the services offered for migrant domestic workers returnees? NGOs and CSOs, we work closely with almost all NGOs and CSOs in Kuwait, aligning and maximizing available programs that will enhance the knowledge and skills of migrant domestic workers that will benefit them. Recently, we have the pre-medical checkup for women, mental health. Yes. The challenges, no freedom of association, limited freedom of movement, safe space for self-expression, mobilization, and logistics. So I think we have the recommendation as well. I put it in the recommendation. I have the recommendation there. So for closing, there are so many things to do and we will keep working. No changes, no progress will happen unless we start making one, organize. We need to organize our collective consciousness and effort, create opportunity, protecting the vulnerable labor sector from danger, establishing a safe environment to all. We are partner for change. Together we are stronger. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I'm sorry, because of limitation of time, I have to cut you short. Now let us hear the last but not the least speaker, Albert Nehru, the General Secretary of the KUDEA from Kenya. He's the only speaker who is speaking from a union in the country of origin. That he can tell us what a union can do to support the organizing of the migrant domestic workers far away in the country of destination. Albert, please.
Hi, everybody. As a union representative, it is important that we realize all workers across the world, also including the migrant workers, and it's through the unions, through associations, where they have a voice. We realize that regardless of country of origin to the country of destination, workers need to be empowered with the knowledge, the skills, and above all, the information, which is very, very important. We know the migrant workers are yet very vulnerable, especially those who migrate in unsafe and irregular ways to destination countries. Seeing that there's not much done by the relevant authorities, we decided to step up as a union to raise their voices by organizing them. We started exerting power and pressure to our government so that we can be able to face and bring in issues of migrant workers together through the association from which country they are. This was helped by the way of petitioning the relevant bodies, especially through the registration bureaus, the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Migration Department, so that we can be able to lobby for bilateral labor agreements and multilateral agreements with the common destination countries. This we have been able to do it very well through cooperation of our umbrella body, Central Organization of Trade Union, COTU, and with our support with other partners. The biggest challenge has been how do we create awareness? We were lucky that the issue of creating awareness, we were able to bring together different civil societies, recruitment agencies, ministries concerned, and above all, creating awareness through the radio, and more bringing common wananchi, common communities together with a village so that you can be able to educate them one by one. Generally, the public was to be introduced and informed about safe migration from the country of origin. And those who are in those countries where they are, we have been getting in touch to make sure that they form networks. These networks have been very, very important to make sure that the union is in direct contact of what is happening. And luckily, the government has been able to sponsor some labor attaches to especially those countries where domestic worker migrants are more vulnerable. Capacity building through the basic education, labor rights, laws, and through their native languages has continued to be part and parcel of what we are doing from the community participation. Public forums has really assisted us to make sure that the public is aware, and especially those who are migrating, they can be aware of safe migration. Land-use campaigns has also assisted us to make sure that the information we are passing and creating awareness forms part and parcel of what could be happening within the society. As a union, we decided to open up with a toll-free line where each union member, of the community, if you feel that it is threatened by Iraq's information of migration, the same could be disseminated to them. Of course, the biggest challenge we have now is for the returnees who are coming from these countries where they have migrated to. Luckily, as a union through the umbrella body, we have, through the associations and through the agencies, we have been able to have information and direct contact so that you can be able to see how we can formulate policies and guidelines on how we can have domestic workers who have been either their rights violated and they are returning to integrate them. It is not simple, it is not cheap, but the most important thing is the will. That once the workers have already known their rights and the government and civil societies are aware, the union has been able to penetrate to make sure that we have domestic workers, migrants, who are already registered with the union. By close of today, we have approximately over 250 domestic returnees who have come back to the country, and the network across these countries of destination have continued to be more stronger by virtue of we have continued to talk to them to make sure that the wider perspective to enhance globalization and social transformation and development of domestic workers, especially migrants, is well achieved through safe, regular, and ordinary way of migrating. The best thing we have done is to make sure that the networks are strong, they are well connected, and the domestic workers and any other worker who has migrated is well informed and is a legitimate person who can be able to talk. So union continues to be the strength, continues to be the voice, and we are continuing to talk with the relevant authorities so that we can step up the issue of raising the voice for migrant workers. Gaps and challenges. Social protection is the major challenge, especially after migrating and coming back to the country. These workers do not have a forum where they can be able to voice their talking. 2, safe migration in terms of going and coming back, because there are also exit doors where they have not been recognized by the government. This is where we are trying to address. Freedom of association is one of the basic rights we have been advocating and creating awareness, more so with the ratification of Convention 189, so that you can make sure that the workers, wherever they are, either domestic workers or any other migrant workers, can be recognized, both the country of origin and the country of destination. We are being encouraged to make sure that safe migration is part and parcel of recognizing migrant workers are workers like any other worker across the world. We call upon everybody to work and join hands so that we can make sure all workers are supported. Thank you very much. Be blessed.
Thank you, Albert. Yeah, thank you for highlighting the importance and the role of the trade unions to provide the strength, the support to all workers, migrant domestic workers. Yeah, thank you to all the panelists. Yeah, unfortunately, time is up, and I just want you to continue to support the IDWF. We have a small delegation now attending the IMRF in New York. They will be there to represent the voice of the migrant domestic workers, the IDWF position there. We have released our position papers on migrant domestic workers, and we hope the governments will hear this. And finally, once again, thank you everyone, especially the panelists, and let us continue to act in one voice to make sure the governments will all hear when they conclude the declaration on the 20th. Thank you and see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, brothers and sisters.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.